He won. He survived 10 years of war, another 10 years of monsters and shipwrecks and gods who wanted him dead, and he made it home. He got everything the epic promised him: the throne, the wife, the son, the kingdom. Every bard from Athens to Syracuse sang his name like a prayer. And then, in the final pages of the oldest adventure story in Western civilization, Odysseus stands in his own great hall, covered in the blood of 108 men he just executed, orders 12 of his own slave women hanged from the rafters, and cannot stop. His son has to restrain him. A goddess has to descend from Olympus and literally erase the memories of the survivors to prevent him from butchering his own citizens in the street. The man who outthought every monster, every god, every king, cannot survive peace. The war never left him. It just changed its target. Here is what no one tells you about the Odyssey. It is not a story about coming home. It is a clinical case study in what happens to a soldier when the civilization he fought for has already collapsed around him, and no one thought to tell him. We have to go back. Not to Ithaca, not even to Troy. We have to go back to the moment the world ended. Around 1200 BCE, something killed almost every major civilization on Earth simultaneously. The Mycenaean palace economies, the Hittite Empire, the great trading cities of the Levantine coast, the Ugaritic merchant networks that had kept the Bronze Age running for 3 centuries. Gone. Not declined, not absorbed. Gone. Burned in many cases. The palace at Mycenae, the one where Agamemnon himself supposedly ruled, shows a destruction layer so complete that archaeologists can read the heat of the fire in the stones. The temperature exceeded 900 degrees Celsius. Someone wanted it not just destroyed, but erased. We do not know exactly what happened. The historical record fractures and goes dark in ways that are genuinely frightening. What we do know is that in the span of roughly 50 years, the most interconnected, sophisticated commercial network the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced simply ceased to exist. The trade routes collapsed, the writing systems were abandoned, populations were uprooted and flung across the sea. Literacy itself, in some regions, vanished entirely for 400 years. The Greeks who lived through this did not call it a collapse. They did not have that clinical vocabulary. What they had was a poet named Homer, or a tradition that remembered itself as Homer, and a story about a king who went to war when the world was whole and spent 20 years trying to find his way back through the ruins of it. That story is not a fairy tale. Strip the mythology away, situate every episode inside the geopolitical reality of 1200 BCE, read the Greek concepts in their original philological weight rather than their sanitized translations, and what you find underneath is something far older and stranger and more brutal than any adventure. You find a document of civilizational trauma. You find the world's first war memoir. But to understand the darkness of the return, you have to understand the crime that made it necessary. You have to understand what the Greeks actually did in Troy on the night they won. The victory was total. 10 years of siege, and then the horse, and then the gates open in the dark, and then the Greeks pour through the streets of a city that is already lost before it knows the battle has begun. What followed, recorded in the epic cycle as the Iliou Persis, the sack of Troy, was not a military operation. It was a descent. The old King Priam ran. He was past fighting age, past everything except the weight of watching his city die. He made it to the altar of Zeus Herkaios, Zeus of the courtyard, the most protected sanctuary in the archaic Greek religious world. Supplication at a divine altar was not merely a custom, it was a transaction with the cosmic order itself. To kill a man at an altar was to declare yourself outside the jurisdiction of gods, outside the social contract that separated civilization from savagery. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, killed Priam at the altar. The blood of a king soaked into sacred ground, and the gods took notice. Cassandra ran too. She made it to the inner sanctum of the temple of Athena, the virgin goddess, the patron of wisdom, and the protector of the Greeks through every grinding year of the war. Ajax the Lesser tore her out of the sanctuary. During the assault, he knocked over the Palladion, the ancient wooden cult statue of the goddess. A mortal virgin violated in the sanctuary of an immortal virgin. The symmetry of the sacrilege was so precise it reads almost as deliberate. Athena, who had spent a decade keeping Odysseus and his countrymen alive, withdrew her protection in a single breath. She did not simply abandon them, she turned. And the child. Astyanax, the infant son of Hector, the last of the Trojan bloodline that could one day threaten Greek dominance. The Greeks threw him from the battlements. They were thorough. What the archaic Greeks called hubris did not mean arrogance in the casual modern sense. It was a specific pathological condition, a delusional state in which a mortal begins to operate as though the laws that govern mortals no longer apply to them. It was understood as a kind of spiritual blindness, and it was considered the most reliable precursor to catastrophic destruction. The Greeks who sacked Troy were not merely cruel. They were, in the technical, theological sense of their own culture, insane. And the universe, in the archaic Greek framework, was obligated to correct that. The correction came as a storm. When the Greek fleet departed the burning coast of the Troad, laden with plunder and slaves, and the particular brittle euphoria of men who have survived something that should have killed them, the sea opened up beneath them. This is often narrated as bad weather, an unfortunate nautical setback on an otherwise triumphant journey. That reading is wrong. In the theological framework of the Odyssey, the storm that scatters the Greek fleet is a weaponized act of divine justice, a coordinated purge of a military force that had become too corrosive to the cosmic order to be permitted to simply sail home and prosper. Athena orchestrates it. Poseidon drives it. The storm is not bad luck. It is a sentence. And here is where the mythological and the historical converge in a way that should make the hair on your neck rise. Because at the same time that the epic tradition describes the Greek world fracturing into scattered, desperate, shipwrecked survivors, the archaeological record shows exactly that happening in reality. The palace economies burning, the populations displaced, the great fleets of the Aegean dissolving into smaller, more desperate formations that the Egyptian records at Medinet Habu would call the Sea Peoples, marauding confederations of the uprooted and the stateless who descended on the coasts of the surviving civilizations like a tide. Odysseus sails into that world, not the bright, heroic Mediterranean of the Iliad, with its grand encampments and its divine councils and its elaborate code of honorable combat. He sails into the aftermath, into the silence after the system failed, into a sea where every island is a potential ambush and every stranger is a potential predator, and the sacred laws that used to govern the interaction between human beings have been dissolved by catastrophe. He doesn't know it yet. None of them do. They depart Troy, believing they are going home to a world that still exists. They are wrong about almost everything. The first thing Odysseus does when he leaves Troy is not navigate toward Ithaca. It is not pray or grieve or hold his surviving men in the fragile solidarity of people who have endured something monstrous together. His first act, the very first decision of the return journey, is to lead his fleet in a raid on the city of Ismarus, home of the Cicones. He sacks the city, he kills the men, he enslaves the women, he distributes the plunder. There is no strategic reason for this. Troy has already fallen. the war is over. What Odysseus does at Ismarus is piracy, clean and simple, the act of a man whose psychology has been so thoroughly remade by a decade of organized violence that peace, when it finally arrives, does not register as a command to stop. It registers as the absence of immediate threat. And in the absence of immediate threat, the only available template for action is the one that kept him alive for 10 years. He raids, he plunders, he moves on. His men celebrate on the beach afterward, drinking the Tsakonis' wine and slaughtering their sheep, and Odysseus begs them to leave before dawn, because something in him, the part that has survived this long by reading threat correctly, knows that this is wrong, knows that the Tsakonis will return with allies, knows that sitting on a beach getting drunk after a raid is a way to die. His men ignore him. They are still operating on the logic of the war, where victory entitles you to the spoils. The Tsakonis return with 6,000 soldiers. Odysseus loses 72 men before he escapes. 72 men, before he has even reached open water. This is what the Odyssey actually begins with. Not wonder, not adventure. The immediate, brutal, entirely self-inflicted cost of a man who cannot turn off the war, surrounded by men who share his condition, leading them all toward consequences none of them can see clearly, because the cognitive framework they built for survival is now destroying them. The gods didn't scatter the fleet because they were malicious. The fleet was already scattering itself. The divine storm only accelerated a process the Greeks had initiated the moment they let themselves become something that could do what they did in Troy. The question that opens the Odyssey is deceptively simple. Can a man who has survived the destruction of a civilization find his way back to what he was before it? Can the mind that learned to do what was done at Troy unlearn it? Or does it carry the fire with it everywhere it goes? The answer is coming, and it is not the one the bards wanted to tell. The sea, in the world Odysseus now sailed, was not a highway. It was a diagnosis. Before the collapse, the Bronze Age Mediterranean had functioned as a single, breathing organism. Merchant ships out of Ugarit carried copper ingots from Cyprus to the smelters of the Levantine coast. Tin moved westward from Anatolia. Egyptian grain fed the palace economies of the Aegean. Mycenaean pottery turned up in the tombs of pharaohs. The whole system depended on a shared assumption so fundamental that no one articulated it until it was gone: that strangers, at their core, could be trusted. That a man arriving at your port from a distant shore was, by default, a potential partner rather than a potential predator. That civilization was the default condition of the world. By 1200 BCE, that assumption was dead. What replaced it was a landscape that the Greeks encoded into every monster Odysseus encountered. Not metaphorically, not as allegory for internal psychological states, though that reading is also true, but literally, geographically, and with a specificity that maps onto the documented archaeological reality of the post-collapse Mediterranean with uncomfortable precision. Each island, each coast, each culture Odysseus stumbles into on his return represents a different way that a society can fail, a different pathology, a different answer to the question of what human beings become when the system that organized them collapses and nothing rises to replace it. The archaic Greeks had a word for the social architecture that prevented this collapse: Xenia. It is usually translated as hospitality, which is accurate the way calling a cathedral a building is accurate. It technically describes the object without capturing anything essential about it. Xenia was the sacred, inviolable protocol of guest-host relations, governed directly by Zeus in his aspect as Xenios, protector of strangers. The law was rigid and non-negotiable. A host must welcome a stranger, offer them a bath, a meal, a bed. Ask no questions until they have eaten, because a man's hunger is more urgent than his host's curiosity. In return, the guest must be respectful, non-destructive, and truthful about their identity and intentions. Violations of Xenia were not social offenses. They were crimes against the cosmic order, answerable to the same divine machinery that had just finished destroying the Greek fleet. In a world without centralized law, without standing armies that enforced peace between settlements, without the administrative apparatus of the palace economies that had just burned, Xenia was the only thing preventing every human interaction from defaulting to violence. It was the operating system of Bronze Age civilization. And everywhere Odysseus sails, he finds it either absent, inverted, or weaponized into a trap. The Cyclops Polyphemus does not merely violate Xenia. He represents a society that has never developed the concept at all. The Cyclopes, Homer tells us, with what reads as clinical detachment, have no community councils, no laws, no agriculture. Each one lives in isolation on his own mountain, tending his own flocks, answerable to no one. They are not savage in the way that implies a fall from a higher state. They are pre-civilizational. They exist in the condition that predates the social contract entirely. When Odysseus and his men enter the cave, they are not entering a hostile household. They are entering a space where the category of guest does not exist, where a stranger is simply a novel protein source that talks. Polyphemus asks for their identity before offering food or shelter. This single detail would have registered to an archaic Greek audience like a klaxon. It is the precise inversion of the Xenia protocol. A civilized host feeds first and questions later. The Cyclops demands credentials before he is offered anything, and when Odysseus invokes Zeus Xenios, the god of guest protection, Polyphemus laughs. His response is chilling in its directness. The Cyclopes are stronger than the gods, and Zeus's protection means nothing here. This is not arrogance. It is an accurate description of a social reality. In a place where Xenia has never been established, its divine guarantor holds no jurisdiction. Odysseus survives the Cyclops, not through strength, not through prayer, not through the martial skills that served him at Troy. He survives through metis. The word is usually translated as cunning or craft, but the Greek carries a charge that the English word discharges. Metis is the intelligence that operates under pressure, the mind that generates solutions when the body cannot enforce them, the capacity for deception so complete that the deceiver and the deceived inhabit different versions of reality simultaneously. In the Iliad, metis was considered a secondary virtue, something that supplemented the primary heroic currency of ba, raw physical force and martial ferocity. Achilles embodied ba. He was the apex predator of the heroic world, a weapon in the shape of a man. When Achilles fought, men died because nothing in the human range of possibility could stop him. But ba is useless in a sealed cave with a boulder in the doorway and a giant who outweighs you by 3 orders of magnitude. Odysseus cannot fight his way out, so he does something far more dangerous. He thinks. He offers the Cyclops wine from the ships, the strong, undiluted wine that was typically cut with water before drinking. Polyphemus has never tasted wine before. He drinks it neat, 3 consecutive bowls, and asks for the name of the generous stranger who has given him such a gift. Odysseus tells him his name is Utis, nobody. The Cyclops, drunk and pleased with himself, promises that his gift to nobody will be to eat him last. He falls asleep. What follows next is the blinding, the burning stake driven into the single eye, the screaming that brings the neighboring Cyclopes to the door. They call out, asking who is hurting him. Polyphemus screams that nobody is killing him. The neighbors, hearing this, assume it is a divine affliction, because if nobody is harming him, the harm must come from the gods, and you do not intervene in divine business. They leave. The philological trap embedded here is one of the most sophisticated pieces of linguistic engineering in ancient literature. When the neighboring Cyclopes ask their question, they phrase the conditional using the Greek words me tis, meaning if no man. Me tis. Said aloud, at speed, in the acoustic register of a voice shouted through a cave door, it is phonetically indistinguishable from metis. Cunning. The Cyclopes are, without knowing it, asking whether cunning is what has hurt their neighbor. And the answer is yes. Cunning is exactly what has hurt him. The name Nobody contains the weapon that deployed it. Odysseus has encoded his survival strategy inside his own anonymity. He drags his men out of the cave, clinging to the bellies of the sheep, and when he is safely offshore, he does something that reads at first like arrogance, and is actually something more complicated. He shouts his real name back at the blinded Cyclops. He cannot resist it. He needs Polyphemus to know who beat him. He needs the record to exist. This is not ego. This is kleos, the defining existential imperative of the Homeric hero. Kleos means immortal fame, the kind that gets woven into songs and survives the death of the body. In the archaic Greek framework, the only available immortality was the immortality of being remembered, of having your name and your deeds circulate through the oral tradition for generations after your bones dissolved into the earth. Kleos was not vanity. It was the primary mechanism of meaning in a world without an afterlife worth the word. The Underworld in Homer is not heaven. It is a gray, witless, suffocating nothing, and the only escape from oblivion is the sound of your own name in the mouths of the living. So Odysseus shouts his name, because a victory no one knows about is not a victory. It is just survival. But Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon, and now Poseidon knows who blinded his son. The god of the sea, the god who governs every wave between Odysseus and Ithaca, takes this personally. The shouted name that was supposed to generate Kleos instead generates a decade of maritime catastrophe. The very need for recognition, the thing that makes survival meaningful, is also the thing that extends the punishment. Odysseus cannot win without claiming the win, and claiming the win makes it harder to win the next time. This is not irony. This is the structural logic of a trauma that feeds on itself. The Laestrygonians are worse than the Cyclops, and worse in a different, more industrial way. They are cannibals, like Polyphemus, but they do not operate in primitive isolation. They have a queen, and a court, and a harbor, and what appears at first approach to be a functioning society. Odysseus, scouting ahead in his own ship, sends 3 men to make contact. They find the queen in her hall, a woman described as enormous as a mountain, who immediately summons her husband, the king. The king grabs one of the Greeks and eats him on the spot. The other 2 run. The Laestrygonians pour out of their city onto the cliffs above the harbor, where the rest of the Greek fleet sits at anchor, and they hurl boulders down onto the ships and spear the men in the water like fish. They turn a harbor, the architecture of welcome, the infrastructure of Xenia, into a killing floor. Most of the fleet dies there. Odysseus escapes only because he had the instinct, or the paranoia, to moor his own ship outside the harbor entrance rather than inside with the others. The paranoia that his men likely found exhausting saves the one ship that survives. The harbor that should have been safety was the trap. In the post-collapse world, the familiar infrastructure of civilization is often the most dangerous thing you will encounter, because it lowers your guard before it kills you. And then there is Circe. Circe is the most sophisticated predator Odysseus encounters, because she does not look like a predator at all. She lives in a grand stone house on the island of Aiaia. She weaves at a great loom. She offers the Greeks food and drink and the aesthetics of high civilization. She is exactly what a traumatized, exhausted, grieving crew wants to find after the massacre at the Laestrygonian harbor. Evidence that the world still contains beauty and order, and women who can make you feel like a human being again. The food and drink are poisoned. The men are transmuted into pigs, retaining their human minds inside animal bodies, fully conscious of what has happened to them and entirely incapable of expressing it. Circe has weaponized hospitality itself. She has taken the ritual of Xenia, the sacred framework that is supposed to produce safety, and converted it into a mechanism of total psychological and physical destruction. She offers the aesthetics of care and delivers degradation. Odysseus survives because the god Hermes intercepts him on the path to her hall and gives him a plant called moly, an antidote to Circe's enchantment. Armed with the antidote, Odysseus drinks her cup without transforming, draws his sword, and threatens her. Circe, recognizing that she has encountered something her magic cannot process, immediately shifts tactics. She offers him her bed. She becomes, in the space of a single confrontation, from predator to host to lover. She is fluid in a way that suggests she has always been performing a role rather than occupying one. There is something here that the source material circles without naming, a pattern visible in the data of the Odyssey that Homer does not articulate as a theme, but that accumulates across every episode like sediment. Every entity that violates Xenia does so by exploiting the expectations that Xenia creates. The Cyclops exploits the convention that you announce yourself honestly to a host. The Laestrygonians exploit the convention that a harbor means safety. Circe exploits the convention that a meal offered by a beautiful woman in a stone hall is not a weapon. The violations are not random. They are strategic. They target the specific trust that Xenia requires, the willingness to be vulnerable in the presence of a stranger, and convert that vulnerability into a vector of destruction. In the world after the Bronze Age collapse, trust had become structurally lethal, and Odysseus, sailing through the ruins of every institution that used to make trust safe, was learning this lesson in the most direct possible way. But here is the thing no one records in the epic. Here is the observation that lives in the space between the lines. Odysseus himself is not innocent of this dynamic. He is not merely the victim of Xenia violations. He is, at intervals, the perpetrator. He raids Ismarus before the gods even begin their punishment. He lies so fluently and so reflexively that his own divine patron Athena compliments him on it like a fellow professional. He spins elaborate false identities: the Cretan pirate, the shipwrecked wanderer, the beggar with nothing worth stealing, with the ease of a man for whom deception has become the native language. There are Egyptian records, carved in stone at the temple of Medinet Habu during the reign of Ramesses III, that describe the invasions of the Sea Peoples in terms of organized maritime raiders arriving from the collapsed Aegean world. Groups called the Peliset, the Teresh, the Jeker, confederation after confederation of the uprooted and the desperate, arriving by sea, with weapons, with a talent for sudden violence, and with nothing left to lose. The Egyptian scribes describe them with a phrase that translates roughly as, "those who came from the islands in the midst of the sea and who made a conspiracy in their camps." A conspiracy in their camps. Men without a home, organized around the technology of violence, operating in the space between the old world and whatever was coming next. Odysseus's Cretan lies, the false identities he spins for Eumaeus and Penelope and anyone who will listen, describe a Cretan pirate who raided the Egyptian coast with a fleet of 9 ships and 480 men. The details are so specific, they read less like invention and more like memory. The raids described match the Egyptian records with the kind of precision that cannot be entirely accidental. Homer, or the tradition that remembered itself as Homer, may have been encoding an actual historical reality inside the fictional tissue of the epic. The hero and the raider were the same man. The wandering veteran and the sea person were the same phenomenon. The difference between Odysseus of Ithaca and the nameless marauders who feature in the Medinet Habu inscriptions may have been nothing more than the poet who happened to remember them. This is the thing the Odyssey is too honest to hide, even when it is trying to. Survival in a collapsed world looks like crime. The skills that keep you alive in the ruins look, from the outside, identical to the skills of the people who caused the ruins. And after 20 years of practicing those skills, you cannot simply set them down. You carry them home. You carry them through the door of your own house. And the question that the second half of the epic is actually asking is not whether Odysseus can reclaim his throne. It is whether a man who has become what the war required him to become can recognize his own family when he finally stands in front of them. He is about to find out that the answer is more complicated and more devastating than anyone who survived the same war would want to admit. There is a specific kind of forgetting that is not accidental. It does not arrive like sleep, softly and without announcement. It arrives like a drug. It has a taste. It has a warmth to it. And the men who surrender to it do not feel themselves surrendering. They feel themselves, for the first time in years, finally at rest. Finally free from the weight of remembering what they saw, what they did, who they were, before the war made them into something their families would not recognize. The forgetting feels, at first, exactly like healing. Odysseus understood, with the part of him that was still rational, that this was the most dangerous thing he had encountered yet. The Lotus Eaters do not attack. They do not set traps. They do not weaponize their hospitality or hurl boulders from cliff tops. They offer food. The fruit of the lotus plant, sweet and heavy, carries inside it a pharmacological mercy. It dissolves the past. Not gradually, not with the blurring that comes from time and distance and the slow mercy of ordinary forgetting. It dissolves the past completely, surgically, leaving the men who consume it intact in body and utterly hollow of history. They remember nothing. They want nothing. They feel no urgency to return to wives or children or the rocky island kingdom they have been fighting toward for months. They want only to remain exactly where they are, in the warm, sunlit suspension of a present tense with no weight behind it. In clinical terms, the lotus fruit is the most precise fictional rendering of dissociation from trauma that ancient literature produced. What these men are experiencing is not peace. It is the chemical simulation of peace. The real thing requires the integration of memory, the long, grinding, painful work of metabolizing what happened at Troy into something the mind can carry without being crushed by it. The lotus fruit bypasses that process entirely. It does not heal the wound. It anesthetizes the patient and leaves the wound open, quietly festering, while the patient smiles at the sky. Odysseus drags his weeping men back to the ships. He uses force. The text is explicit. They do not want to come. They are weeping with the specific grief of addicts being removed from the substance that has finally made them comfortable. And Odysseus ties them under the rowing benches and orders the fleet to move. His men hate him for it in that moment. He does it anyway. Because the thing that the lotus fruit takes, the thing that these men are so willing to surrender, is not just memory of suffering. It is identity itself. You cannot be Odysseus of Ithaca, husband of Penelope, father of Telemachus, the man who held his fleet together through 10 years of war and divine punishment, if you cannot remember that any of those things are true. The lotus fruit does not offer forgetting. It offers erasure. And erasure, in the Homeric framework, is the only death that matters. Because the true opposite of kleos, immortal fame, is not a quiet death in old age. It is lethe, forgetting. The condition of being unmemorable, of passing through the world without leaving a mark that persists after the body fails. The underworld in Homer is populated by the forgotten as much as the dead. The shades who cluster at the pit of blood in Book 11 are not merely dead. They are witless, fluttering, mindless residue, conscious of nothing until they drink and remember. They have already experienced lethe. Physical death just made it official. This is why the Calypso episode is not a love story, and it is not a temptation, and it is certainly not a vacation. It is a burial. The island of Ogygia sits at the absolute edge of the navigable world. Homer locates it at the navel of the sea, which sounds like a position of centrality, but functions as one of radical isolation. The island exists in a permanent meteorological ambiguity, lush and green and fragrant with cedar and alder and flowering plants, but surrounded by a sea so empty and so featureless that navigation fails. There are no landmarks. There are no stars that resolve into recognizable patterns from this latitude. The island is beautiful in the way that a sealed room can be beautiful, decorated, comfortable, entirely enclosed. You can appreciate the aesthetics from inside while simultaneously understanding that the walls are permanent. Calypso's name comes from the Greek verb kalyptein, to cover, to conceal, to hide. She is not named for what she gives. She is named for what she does to you. She conceals Odysseus from the world. 7 years. 7 years during which the greatest navigator of the Greek heroic tradition, the man whose name was synonymous with survival and cunning and the refusal to be defeated, simply does not exist in any record that reaches human ears. His wife believes him dead. His son grows up without a father, and without the authority that a father's presence would provide, watching the suitors consume the household like an infection, while he is too young and too alone to stop them. His kingdom erodes. His name, which he sacrificed everything to protect, which he shouted back at a blinded giant at the cost of 10 more years of suffering, specifically to ensure that the record existed, circulates only as rumor, as absence. Calypso offers him immortality, eternal life, eternal youth, the permanent warm body of a goddess who desires him. This is, in the transactional logic of the ancient world, an extraordinary offer. It is also precisely worthless to a Greek hero. Immortality in Ogygia is not transcendence. It is the world's most luxurious form of erasure. If Odysseus accepts, he generates no further kleos. His nostos remains incomplete, which, in the Greek framework, means it does not exist. An unfinished return is the same as no return. He dies in Troy, effectively, the moment Calypso's door closes behind him. And what lives on in Ogygia is a body without a history, a face without a name that anyone will remember. The text introduces Odysseus here, in his first appearance in the entire epic, sitting on a rock at the edge of the island, staring out at the empty sea, weeping. He has been doing this every day for 7 years. He weeps for Ithaca, yes, and for Penelope, but the weeping is also something more precise than homesickness. It is the sound of a man resisting disappearance with the only tool still available to him. Memory is the act of resistance. The tears are not weakness. They are the ongoing assertion that he exists, that he came from somewhere, that the thread of his identity has not been fully severed yet. Each day he refuses the comfort of the island. Each day he chooses the pain of remembering over the anesthesia of acceptance, is a day he remains Odysseus, rather than becoming the nameless consort of a goddess at the edge of the world. There is a parallel that the epic does not draw, but that the historical record makes available. In the decades after the Bronze Age collapse, Egyptian administrative records document something that the archaeologists call the problem of the returnees. Soldiers and administrators from the collapsed palace economies who had been serving in foreign campaigns or trading missions found themselves, when the system fell, effectively stranded. The institutions they served no longer existed. The ports they were supposed to return to had been burned. The chain of command had dissolved. Some of these men spent years in foreign service, in Nubia, in the Levant, in Cyprus, waiting for orders that never came from a hierarchy that no longer existed. The ones who eventually made it home found a home so altered by collapse that the act of return was itself disorienting, a psychological second shock after the first. They had survived by holding on to the memory of a place that had changed beyond recognition by the time they arrived. The return was not a resolution. It was a second wound. Odysseus leaves Ogygia on a raft. He builds it himself, alone, and navigates by the stars for 17 days, and is almost killed by Poseidon for the second time, and arrives on the shores of Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians, half-drowned, naked, covered in salt brine, sleeping under a pile of leaves in the dark. He is, at this moment, indistinguishable from any refugee the post-collapse Mediterranean had produced. He has no ship, no crew, no weapons, no clothing, no name that anyone in this place can verify. He is pure need. The Phaeacians are the last functioning instance of Xenia in the epic. They are, in some readings, the last functioning civilization in Odysseus's world. Their king Alcinous welcomes the unnamed stranger, offers him food and clothing, and bath and rest before asking who he is, adheres to every protocol of the divine law with a punctiliousness that reads almost as nostalgia, as though Homer is describing something that used to be normal and is now, in the world of the poem, a rare artifact. Odysseus weeps when the blind bard Demodocus sings of the Trojan War. He weeps behind his cloak, hiding the tears from the Phaeacians, and Alcinous sees it anyway and responds with extraordinary delicacy, redirecting the bard to a different song to spare his guest pain. This, the text implies, is what civilization feels like. This is what the world was supposed to be. And the Phaeacians, for their kindness, for their generous and entirely appropriate Xenia, will later be punished by Poseidon, their ship turned to stone in the harbor as they return from delivering Odysseus home. The god of the sea destroys them for helping the man he wants to suffer. Civilized behavior, the epic tells us, with a bleak honesty it does not seem to notice, is not protected. It is targeted. But before the Phaeacians deliver him to Ithaca, before the brutal machinery of the homecoming begins, Odysseus must go somewhere else first. Down, literally down, to the border of the world of the dead, to perform the most disturbing ritual in the entire epic, and receive information he cannot get from any living source. Circe sends him. The dead prophet Tiresias holds the navigational knowledge Odysseus needs. There is no other route. The ritual is called the Nekia. The word refers to a specific necromantic practice, the summoning of the dead through blood sacrifice, and that is documented not only in Homer, but in fragments of older traditions that suggest the practice, or something like it, was real, performed at physical sites believed to be entrances to the underworld. Odysseus travels to the sunless edge of the world, to the land of the Cimmerians, where the sun never rises, and the air itself feels thick and wrong. And he digs a trench in the damp earth with his sword, and pours in the libations, milk and honey and wine and water and barley meal. Then he cuts the throats of a black ram and a black ewe over the trench, and the dark blood pools into the earth. And the dead come. They come in silence. They come as clouds of shadow, fluttering at the edge of the firelight, drawn by the heat and vitality of the blood, the way the starving are drawn to the smell of food. The dead in Homer are not spirits in the medieval sense, not conscious and articulate entities inhabiting some organized afterlife. They are idola, shadows, the enfeebled residue that persists after the animating force of life departs. They retain the shape of who they were, but not the substance. Without blood, they cannot think, cannot speak, cannot remember. They exist in a state of witless, fluttering nothingness that is genuinely terrible to contemplate, aware enough to suffer the absence of consciousness, not conscious enough to process the suffering. Odysseus stands over the pit with his sword drawn, holding back the swarming dead, and the cold of that place is not the cold of winter air. It is the cold of an absence of warmth so complete it has texture, pressing against exposed skin like pressure rather than temperature. The screaming of the shades is not loud. It is thin, a high, chittering sound like bats in a cave, which is exactly the comparison Homer reaches for, and the sound of it is somehow worse than loud screaming would be. It is the acoustic register of things that have lost too much of themselves to produce a full human sound. Tiresias drinks first, then Odysseus's mother, Anticlea, who died of grief while he was wandering, waiting for a son who did not come. Odysseus does not let her drink until Tiresias has spoken. He holds her back from the blood that would restore her voice, holds her with his sword while she flutters at the edge of consciousness, a mother unable to recognize her own son. And he watches her and does not allow himself to break. The suppression required for this is extraordinary. It is the same suppression that allowed him to function for 10 years in a war, the same deadening of normal human response that made him useful at Troy and is making him dangerous everywhere else. He does not choose between his mission and his grief. He simply delays the grief until the mission is complete. When Anticlea finally drinks and speaks, she tells him Penelope is faithful, that Telemachus holds the estate as best he can, that his father, Laertes, wastes away in the countryside, grieving. Then she tells him that she died not of disease or violence, but of longing for him. And the word she uses for that longing is the same word the epic uses for the kind of grief that physically consumes the body from inside. She missed him to death. Literally. She died of his absence. He tries to embrace her. He reaches out, and she dissolves through his arms 3 times, insubstantial as smoke, as shadow, as the memory of a person, rather than the person themselves. And this is the moment where the composure finally cracks, where the armor of metis and vigilance and disciplined emotional suppression fails for just a breath, and what comes through is something raw and unmanageable. He cannot hold his mother. She is right in front of him, and he cannot hold her. The word the epic uses for his reaching is the same word used for the gesture of a drowning man reaching for something solid. He speaks to the shade of Agamemnon, who was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra the moment he returned home from Troy, assassinated at his own welcome home feast, stabbed in his bath while still wearing the ceremonial robes of return. Agamemnon's warning to Odysseus is the most practically useful intelligence he will receive in the underworld. Never trust the homecoming. Never arrive openly. Never assume that the space you left is still the space you think you are returning to. The world changes in your absence, and it does not wait for your permission, and it does not leave a note. And then, the shade of Achilles. Achilles in the Iliad made the defining choice of the heroic world. He was given the option, explicitly, by his divine mother Thetis, who knew the future. A long, quiet, obscure life in Phthia, or a short, blazing, famous life at Troy. He chose Troy. He chose Kleos. He chose the immortality of the sung name over the warmth of an ordinary life. He died young and beautiful and furious, and the bards sang him forever afterward as the exemplar of heroic value. The man who understood the deal, and accepted it with open eyes. In the underworld, Odysseus tries to comfort him. He tells Achilles that he is honored among the dead as he was among the living, that his name endures, that the choice was worth what it cost. Achilles says, "I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house, above ground, than king of kings among the dead." 11 words, approximately, depending on the translation. The greatest warrior of Greek mythology, the man whose name has been used for 3,000 years as a synonym for heroic sacrifice, confessing that the entire ideological system he organized his life around was a lie, that the glory means nothing in the cold, that the songs the bards sing cannot be heard in the underworld, that the immortality of fame is cold comfort to the immortal shade of a man who chose to die for it. The confession does not merely comfort Odysseus, it retroactively reframes the entire Trojan War. If Kleos is not worth the death that purchases it, then every man who died on the plains of Troy died for an accounting error. The heroic code, the system of values that organized the Achaean coalition and sustained 10 years of brutal attrition warfare, collapses in a single sentence from the man who best embodied it. The war was not noble. It was a transaction where both parties overpaid and neither received what they were promised. And here is what the epic implies but does not state directly, what lives in the space between Achilles' confession and the final books of the poem. If Kleos is a lie, then the deception, the cunning, the willingness to wear a beggar's rags and lie fluently and survive by metis rather than die by bie, is not a lesser form of heroism. It is the only honest response to a system that was always willing to spend men like currency. Odysseus, who was never the purest exemplar of the heroic code, who was always slightly embarrassing in his practicality, his reluctance to die beautifully, his tendency to choose survival over glory, was right all along. Not in a triumphant way, in the way that being right about a tragedy still means you witnessed the tragedy. He leaves the underworld with the navigational knowledge he came for, and a grief he will carry the rest of the way home. He has spoken to his dead mother and failed to embrace her. He has heard the confession of the greatest hero of his generation. He has looked into the face of what the war actually produced and seen clearly, maybe for the first time, that none of them were going home to what they left. What is waiting for him in Ithaca is not a homecoming. It is a siege. And he is going to conduct it exactly like the soldier he cannot stop being. He arrived the way he had learned to arrive everywhere. In disguise, at night, alone. The ships that had departed Troy were gone. The crews were dead, most of them, consumed by storms and giants, and the slow attrition of 10 years of wandering through a world that had stopped observing the laws that used to make survival predictable. Odysseus came home to Ithaca not as a king returning in triumph with his fleet at his back and the spoils of Troy gleaming in the hold. He came as a single man, deposited on a familiar shoreline by foreign sailors while he slept, waking on the beach of his own island without immediately recognizing it. The goddess Athena had to tell him where he was. The island he had spent 20 years trying to reach was, in his first waking moments upon it, unrecognizable. This is not a navigational detail. This is a diagnosis. The beach of Ithaca looked the way it always had. The same rocks, the same curve of the bay, the same quality of light on the water in the early morning. What had changed was the man looking at it. 20 years of war and wandering had rebuilt the cognitive architecture of Odysseus's perception so thoroughly that the familiar read as foreign. His eyes were calibrated for threat, for the scanning assessment of an unknown coastline, for the rapid identification of cover and choke points and potential ambush positions. He looked at home and saw a landing zone. Athena disguises him as an old beggar, and Odysseus accepts this, not with reluctance, but with something that reads in the Greek as professional approval. He has been performing identities for so long that wearing a false one feels more natural than wearing his own. The beggar's rags are not a humiliation. They are operational camouflage. He is infiltrating his own household with the same methodology he would use to infiltrate an enemy position. Because after 20 years, the distinction between the two has become dangerously thin. He goes first to the farmstead of his swineherd Eumaeus, and the loyalty he finds there, the loyalty of a slave who is grieved for a master he believes dead for 2 decades, is so unexpected and so total that Odysseus cannot respond to it directly. He lies to Eumaeus. He spins one of his elaborate Cretan false identities, the wandering shipwrecked pirate, the man of no fixed origin or allegiance. He sits by the fire in his own servant's hut and eats his own pigs and listens to his own faithful employee mourn for him. And he cannot tell the truth. Not because the truth would be strategically unwise, though it would be, but because the habit of concealment is now so deeply wired that honesty in an uncontrolled environment feels like exposure, and exposure feels like death. Jonathan Shea, the clinical psychiatrist who spent decades working with Vietnam veterans and mapping their psychological profiles against the Homeric epics, identified this specific symptom as one of the most consistent and devastating consequences of complex combat trauma. The eradication of social trust. Not the diminishment of it, the eradication. The traumatized veteran returns from the war having learned, at the cellular level, that trust is a vulnerability, and that vulnerability gets you killed. This learning is correct in the environment where it was acquired. It is catastrophically incorrect in every other environment. But the nervous system does not know the difference between Troy and Ithaca. It knows only that the last time it lowered its guard, men died. So it does not lower its guard. Not for a swineherd, not for a son, not for a wife who has been faithful for 20 years and is weeping in the hall above. He tests Telemachus when his son arrives. He tests Eumaeus. He tests Penelope so extensively and so cruelly that the reunion that should be the emotional climax of the entire epic reads instead as an interrogation. Penelope, who has survived 20 years of siege by the suitors through her own form of metis, her famous weaving and unweaving of the burial shroud, recognizes her husband only when he demonstrates knowledge of a secret that no one else could possess, the construction of their marriage bed, built around a living olive tree rooted in the earth, immovable, a piece of furniture that is also a foundation. She has been testing him too. She has spent 20 years surrounded by men who want something from her, and she has learned the same lesson the war taught Odysseus. Trust is a liability. Verification is survival. They have both been changed by the same absence into people who cannot trust each other without evidence. This is the Odyssey's quietest tragedy, and the one it is least interested in lingering over, because the epic has somewhere more brutal to go first. 108 men had taken up residence in Odysseus's great hall. They were the sons of the noble families of Ithaca and the surrounding islands, and they had arrived to court Penelope in the years after Odysseus's absence stretched past the point where reasonable hope of return was sustainable. What began as courtship had metastasized into occupation. They ate Odysseus's livestock. They drank his wine stores. They slept with his slave women. They had been there so long that the youngest of them had never known any other arrangement of the world. They had planned, in some of the darker strategic discussions recorded in the epic, to murder Telemachus to prevent him from inheriting and expelling them. They were not merely guests who had overstayed their welcome. They were an occupying force operating inside the architecture of a household, exploiting the institution of Xenia from within, in the most total and systematic way the epic imagines. Odysseus surveyed the situation with the eye of a man who had spent 10 years inside the walls of Troy and understood, at a level below conscious strategy, what needed to happen. He could not fight 108 armed aristocrats in open combat. Open combat was suicide. What he needed was a sealed room, a depleted enemy, a choke point, and the element of absolute surprise. He had built wooden horses. He could build this. He worked with Telemachus over the days before the killing to quietly remove every weapon from the Great Hall, every sword and spear and shield mounted on the walls, carrying them to the storeroom under the pretext of protecting them from the smoke and the damp. The suitors watched this happen and did not stop it, because the beggar overseeing the process appeared to be a confused old man following the instructions of the young heir, and 108 armed aristocrats do not feel threatened by a confused old man and a boy. The deception required them to underestimate him, and the disguise guaranteed they would. He had designed the camouflage for exactly this purpose. The morning of the killing, Penelope announced a contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through the aligned axes of 12 iron heads would win her hand. The suitors accepted. They were confident. They tried, one by one, to string the bow, and one by one they failed. Because the bow was Odysseus's, built for Odysseus's specific strength and trained muscle memory, and none of them had either. The wood was dense, and the tension was enormous, and the stringing of it required not just physical force, but a technical knowledge of the weapon that only its owner possessed. The old beggar asked to try. The suitors resisted. It was undignified, they said, inappropriate. What would it look like if a wandering beggar managed what the best men of the islands could not? Penelope insisted. The beggar was given the bow. He turned it in his hands. He checked the wood for warping the way a craftsman checks a tool after long storage, running his fingers along the grain with a familiarity that should have alarmed someone, if anyone had been paying attention to anything other than their own embarrassment. He strung it without apparent effort. The sound of the string being drawn was a single, high, clear note, like a swallow singing, which is the exact image Homer chooses, and the surreal precision of that image, the domestic bird in the killing room, is the last moment of quiet in the epic. He shot through all 12 axes. Then he turned the bow toward Antinous. Antinous was the de facto leader of the suitors, the arrogant architect of most of their worst behavior, the man who had most actively plotted the murder of Telemachus. He was in the act of raising a golden cup of wine to his lips when the arrow took him through the throat. He had not seen it coming. None of them had understood yet what was happening. He fell, dragging the table down with him, and the cup of wine and the bread and the roasted meats scattered across the stone floor and mixed with the blood pooling out of the wound in his neck. And the suitors scrambled to the walls, looking for the weapons that were no longer there. Odysseus told them who he was. He stood at the threshold, the elevated sill of the great door, the architectural choke point that controlled movement in and out of the hall, and he told them his name and his intention. He was not making a speech. He was conducting the psychological phase of the ambush, the moment where the enemy understands the totality of what has been prepared for them, the moment where panic replaces calculation, and the outcome becomes inevitable. Eurymachus, the diplomat of the suitors, the smooth-tongued rationalizer who had survived this long through verbal agility, tried to negotiate. He placed all blame on Antinous, who was already dead and could not dispute the characterization. He offered financial restitution, massive quantities of bronze and gold, enough to compensate for everything consumed. He appealed to reason, to economics, to the pragmatic logic of a man who had just demonstrated that he understood leverage. Odysseus rejected every word. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution conducted in the grammar of a battle. Telemachus and 2 loyal servants armed themselves from the weapons stored in the back room and took positions. The suitors threw whatever came to hand, furniture and footstools and the few spears they managed to retrieve through a treacherous servant, and some of them found weapons, and some of them died trying. And Odysseus moved through all of it with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has been in rooms like this before, who knows how to read the arc of a thrown spear before it leaves the hand, who understands that the most dangerous moment is the one where the enemy finds a weapon, and not the one where they are visibly attacking. The goatherd Melanthius had been smuggling weapons to the suitors from the storeroom. When he was caught, Odysseus had him trussed and suspended from a roof beam, where he hung in agony through the entire remainder of the massacre. When it was over, Melanthius was taken to the courtyard and butchered in the manner of the worst atrocities of the Trojan plains: nose, ears, genitals, hands, feet, removed and fed raw to the dogs. The punishment was designed to communicate something beyond simple execution. It was designed to leave nothing behind that could be honored, nothing that could become the seed of a martyr's story. It was the elimination of a person so total it erased even the corpse as a meaningful object. Odysseus brought Troy home, not as a memory, as a methodology. Eurycleia counted the disloyal maids, 12 women who had slept with the suitors, chosen by their own complex negotiations with power in a household where their real master had been absent for 20 years. Whether these negotiations were voluntary or coerced, whether these women had made choices from desire or from terror of the armed aristocrats living in the hall, the epic does not ask, because the epic is not interested in that question. Odysseus is not interested in that question. He orders them to clean the hall first, to carry the bodies out and scrub the blood from the chairs and the flesh from the floors, to restore the surface of the great room to the appearance of a functioning household before they are themselves disposed of. They worked in silence. There is no record of what they said to each other during that cleaning, or whether they said anything at all. The text moves quickly through this section, clinical and brief, as though lingering would require engaging with something the narrator prefers to process from a distance. They cleaned the hall. They were led to the courtyard. Telemachus decided that a clean death, the kind afforded to beasts and soldiers, was too dignified for women who had dishonored the house. He strung a ship's cable between 2 pillars across the portico. Nooses. All 12. Their feet, Homer writes, twitched for a little while, but not for long. And the comparison the epic reaches for is birds, doves or thrushes caught in a net, wings beating once or twice against the mesh before they still. The image is so quiet, so precise, so deliberately small scale for something that should register as catastrophe. 12 women compared to 12 birds, and the twitching lasting not long at all, and then it was done. From the perspective of Bronze Age legal reality, the execution of the maids was not aberrant. In a world without courts, without institutional mechanisms for adjudicating loyalty during a political vacuum, the oikos, the household, was a sovereign territory, and the kyrios, its master, held absolute authority over its members. Women, in this framework, were legal property. The maid's execution was, in the technical language of the era's social code, a property rights enforcement action. To judge it by modern legal standards is anachronistic. To be comfortable with it is something else entirely. The text is not comfortable with it. The bird comparison is doing something very specific. It is asking you to see these women as small and fragile and not quite human scale. And the reason it needs to do this is that if you see them full size, as people, the scene becomes unbearable in a way that disrupts the epic's momentum toward resolution. Homer knows what he is doing. He has looked directly at the worst thing in the poem and found the smallest possible frame for it. Odysseus fumigated the hall afterward with burning sulfur, moving through the smoke with a brazier, purifying the architecture of the household with the acrid, burning smell that served simultaneously as antiseptic and spiritual cleansing. The sulfur would have stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat with a taste like struck iron. The hall would have been dark with the smoke, and hot, and the smell of blood and sulfur together creates something that penetrates the sinuses and does not leave quickly. He moved through it alone, the burning brand in his hand, performing a ritual purification of a space he had just filled with the dead. He thought it was over. He was wrong. Book 24 opens with the fathers of the suitors, the grieving, furious fathers of 108 dead aristocrats, arming themselves in the streets of Ithaca, converging on the farmstead of old Laertes to extract blood vengeance from the house of Odysseus. They are led by Eupeithes, the father of Antinous, the first man killed, the one who died with the wine still in his hand. They are not wrong by the logic of the world they inhabit. Their sons were killed. Vengeance is the only available mechanism of justice in a world without courts. They are doing exactly what the social code requires them to do. Odysseus arms himself. He is ready. He has not stopped being ready. He has not lowered his guard for a single moment since he returned to Ithaca, and the prospect of more killing does not horrify him the way it should. It presents itself to his nervous system as the continuation of a situation he is equipped to handle, which is what every situation has become. Athena stops it. She descends physically and commands a truce and erases the memory of the massacre from the minds of the surviving Ithacans. The divine intervention is usually read as a tidy resolution, the gods restoring order to a situation that human action had complicated beyond recovery. But there is something deeply disturbing in what the intervention actually means. The trauma of Ithaca is not healed. It is suppressed. The memories are not processed or integrated or mourned. They are deleted by external divine force from the minds of people who had no agency in their deletion. The island does not achieve peace. It achieves the administrative simulation of peace imposed from above, because the organic mechanisms of human reconciliation had been so thoroughly destroyed by 20 years of absence and dysfunction and massacre that they could not function without divine assistance. Odysseus, standing in the moment where the fighting stops, does not appear relieved. The text does not describe relief. It describes the cessation of combat, which is not the same thing. The war has ended. The war continues inside the man who survived it, and will continue there until the body that contains it finally fails. Here is the deepest irony in the Odyssey, and the one that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Odysseus's greatest strength, Metis, the cunning that kept him alive when everything else tried to kill him, was also the mechanism of his isolation. Every deception required distance. Every disguise required the suppression of genuine feeling. Every strategic relationship required the suspension of authentic connection. By the time he reached Ithaca, the faculty that had saved him had also made him incapable of the one thing that home requires, the willingness to be known. He had practiced concealment for so long that revelation felt like exposure, and exposure felt like dying. He could not be Odysseus without performing Odysseus. The man who survived the war had, in surviving it, consumed the man who existed before it. This is not ancient. This is the specific feeling of building an identity so heavily around the skills required to endure something terrible that when the terrible thing ends, the identity has no other architecture. It is the experience of the veteran who cannot talk about the war and cannot stop thinking about it. It is the experience of anyone who has survived something that required them to become someone else to get through it, and who reaches the other side to find that the original person is no longer accessible, that the survival self has colonized the space where the ordinary self used to live. You have been listening to the story of a man who won every battle and lost the war that mattered most. But there is a thread in this narrative that was never fully closed. A figure who moved through the wreckage of the Bronze Age with a clarity that none of the kings possessed, who saw the collapse not as catastrophe, but as information, and who built something new in the rubble that the epic tradition was almost too embarrassed to record. The bards remembered Odysseus. They almost forgot the person who understood, better than anyone, what the ruins were actually for. That story is already pulling at you. You just don't know it yet.